Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Is America suffering from a silent economic depression that's gradually creeping into your life, but you just haven't noticed? That's what today's guest believes. Where do you look for signs of this, and what do you do about it? A silent depression, today on Get Rich Education. If you like the Get Rich Education podcast, you're going to love our Don't Quit Your Daydream newsletter. No AI here. I write every word of the letter myself. It wires your mind for wealth. It helps you make money in your sleep and updates you on vital real estate investing trends. It's free. Sign up at getricheducation.com/letter. It's real content that makes a real difference in your life, spiced with a dash of humor. Rather than living below your means, learn how to grow your means. Right now, you can also easily get the letter by texting GRE to 66866. Text GRE to 66866.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, heard across 188 world nations, including Equatorial Guinea. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. This is Get Rich Education, the voice of real estate investing since 2014. How can your quality of life and your one and only standard of living actually be getting worse today, especially here in the United States? From your iPhone with fast Wi-Fi to a stable electrical grid to a bounty of produce for you to select at the supermarket. Well, we'll soon learn why today's renowned guest and prolific author feels like we've already entered a silent depression. He is going to make his case. We have plenty to get to with our guest, but first, I've got a problem with one of my property managers, and this is a really weird one. In 2 decades of doing this, this is among the weirdest. What happened a while back is that one of my tenants that this manager manages, the tenant paid his rent with a paper money order, and he placed it in the property manager's drop box there at their offices. The money order was stolen out of the drop box by a thief. The manager doesn't want to take responsibility for it, and I'm the one that's been out the rent money, the $1,550. I've told the manager, no, I'm not going to be pushed around like that. So there are more details on that, which I expect to tell you about next week. It is an interesting situation, to say the least. And I'll give you more on the payment stolen from the manager's overnight drop box. Now, today's guest will join me from Buenos Aires, Argentina, where they currently have inflation of perhaps 100% or 200% per year. We're going to talk about real estate and probably more with what he calls the silent depression. Now, I'm probably a more upbeat, optimistic sort than our guest in general, but that does not make him wrong at all with this silent depression. But here, in a world where we've increasingly heard the word diversity a lot for the last decade, well, there are a lot of ways to think of diversity, and I like to champion some diversity of thought around here with our guest's viewpoint today. Now, I just recently saw a YouTube video of today's guest on the Phil Donahue show in 1980. It was probably about the best-known talk show that there was back in that era. And by the way, I'll leave that link in the show notes for you so that you can watch it too. And since today's episode is episode number 485, you can get the show notes either at getricheducation.com/485 or on your podcatcher. But yeah, Phil Donahue, he was kind of before my time, but yeah, really well-known show. And it's interesting to see today's guest and what he looked like back then. And from watching that video myself, I can tell you that one place where I do need to give this guest credit is with consistency. Now, does every single the world is going to end sort of thing that he says will happen, does that end up happening? That's up for you to determine. But, he has been consistent on promoting his ideals for a smaller government and more He's a returning guest. Let's meet him and discuss the silent depression. Are we on the verge of an economic depression known as a silent depression where you're not aware of it? Today's guest has pointed out that during the 1930s Great Depression, the average home cost just 3 times the average income, but today it costs about 8 times as much. The average car cost about 46% of a year's earnings back then. Today it eats up about 85% of the annual average wage. Rent, which previously claimed just 16% of yearly income, now demands an astounding 42%. So by these metrics and others, you might wonder if the average person is actually in a worse position than during the Great Depression, which was the most challenging economic period in the last 100 years. A lot of people feel it. You might be getting squeezed. And by the end here, you'll hear some new ideas for what you can actually do about it. We have a rather revered guest here with us today. He's been here a few times before to discuss other economic and real estate concepts. He's a very popular author, often writing around the topic of crisis investing and known as the International Man. He hosts a podcast on YouTube called Doug Casey's Take. He's known as the International Man because he's extremely well-traveled. He has residences in multiple nations today. Hey, it's great to have back on GRE the incomparable Doug Casey.
Thanks, Keith. It's a pleasure to be here. At the moment, I'm in Buenos Aires, where I've lived part of the year for a long time.
Truly the International Man, living up to it today. Doug, I touched on housing to start with. We're a real estate show. Housing is one's biggest recurring expense in life, unless it's taxes. But today, I actually think it's a valid question. Is real estate cheap in the United States? Is it adequately priced or is it overpriced? Now, depending on how you slice it, the median U.S. home value is $450K. But if your mind shoots right to dollars like that when you consider valuation, the dollar has been debased so much that it's a pretty poor measuring stick. I know you like gold. A bar of gold is the same today as it was 100 years ago and 1,000 years ago. And today it takes about 40% fewer ounces of gold to buy a home today than the long-run 100-year average. So what we just did there is we got rid of dollars. We compared the relative cost between two real assets, gold and real estate. You brought up a really good point in one of your articles, though. I think it's a better way to measure the cost of housing. As a percent of one's income, it takes 2.5 times to 3 times as much of that annual income to own a home or rent a home today than it did in the 1930s. So when we think about housing cost, what are your thoughts?
It depends on where you are and where shall I start. Right now, as I said, I'm in Buenos Aires, and the apartment that I'm in here is about 5,500 square feet in a part of town which is very much like the Upper East Side of New York. It's called the Recoleta. Now, what would a very classy top building with 24-hour security apartment of 5,500 square feet cost you on the Upper East Side of New York? I'd say probably $20 million, roughly. Here in Buenos Aires, this apartment has probably got a current market price of about $1 million. In other words, 5% of what it is in New York.
Yeah.
Costs of maintaining it are in line with that. That's point number one. Point number two is in most of the world, or certainly here in South America, when you buy something, you buy it for cash. In the U.S., when you buy something, it's usually for a mortgage. And the old saying, I'll give you the price you want if you give me the terms I want.
Right.
Not quite as attractive as it was just a while ago, where the average mortgage now, 30-year mortgage, fixed in the U.S. is 7%, and for a while it was 8%. What do I think of the price of housing in the U.S.? That's where most of your listeners live. First of all, housing is not, in my opinion, an investment. It's a consumer good. It's a very expensive consumer good. Now, throwaway consumer goods like toothbrushes, longer-lived consumer goods like a suit of clothes, longer yet like a car, and a house is just a longer-lived consumer good. But an investment is something that produces new wealth.
Right.
Housing doesn't It can. I mean, if you use it for business, yes, okay. Look, treat your house like a consumer good. That's the first mistake that everybody makes. They think it's an investment that's going to go up. It's not. It's like a car. It should depreciate. It's got expenses to maintain it, not income that maintains you. I know you can rent it out and so forth, but
yeah, we champion residential income property around here, something that I think you and I do consider an asset. But yeah, you're completely right. When you talk about the primary residence side, a home is primarily a liability, not an asset. Why is that? Because a home takes money out of your pocket every month rather than putting money into your pocket every month like you touched on. Doug, before we go on, about that 5,500 square foot apartment there in Buenos Aires, I'm not familiar with the area. Can you just tell me a little bit more about the amenities that you have there? Are there very steep condo association dues? Is there a doorman? Tell me more about it.
Well, we have a doorman here in the building. We only have 6 apartments in this building. I have a 2-story penthouse, so it's probably the best apartment in the building. This area, the Recoleta, like I said, it's like the Upper East Side of New York. We have lots of fine restaurants with short walk away. I pay my maid. We have a full-time maid here in addition. She earns $1,000 a month. Where can you get a full-time maid in the U.S. for $1,000 a month? Let me point something out that's very interesting. In Argentina, they elected a new president, and this is one of the most radical political changes in all of Western history. The new president of Argentina is a chap named Javier Milei. He identifies radically and openly as an anarcho-capitalist. In other words, what he's interested in doing is basically tearing apart the government of Argentina and getting rid of as much of it as he can, all of it, if he can. Now, Argentina is full of taxes, full of regulations. I mean, it's a delightful place to live, but if you want to do business or create wealth, it's a very bad place to live.
Full of inflation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, right now they have inflation of about, they say 140% per year, but it's more like 200 or 300% per year. You can't trust the Argentine government's figures at all. You can only trust the U.S. government's figures marginally more. But Milei, as we talk, is firing massive numbers of government employees. He's eliminating agencies and so forth in the government. And the next step will be radically reduce taxes, radically reduce regulations. So this apartment here is, I think, within the next 5 years, going to be selling for about what its sister on the Upper East Side of New York might be selling at. So I hope to make 10 to 1 on my money on this piece of real estate as a speculation. And it's a nice place to live in the meantime.
Yeah, with Milei in Argentina, it'll be interesting to see if he sticks with their currency, moving from the Argentine peso to the dollar. It sounds like he might already be backing off of that. But getting back to your condo there, Doug, and yeah, that would be a terrific arbitrage play if you indeed bought low and the Buenos Aires market goes up. It sounds like an exceptional value you get there. When we talk about are homes overpriced today, especially in the United States, or are they underpriced? We talked about how one spends more of the proportion of income on housing today, and if that might make them trend toward this silent depression. But of course, you also get more home today. I mean, 100 plus years ago in the United States, a new Victorian style home, it had sparse amenities and maybe 950 square feet. And today, an American home averages 2,415 square feet. That's the figure. So you might pay 2.5 times more of your income, but you might get 2.5 times more square footage. And of course, maybe like you're finding in your place there in Argentina, Doug, the average American home, it has features today that would have been considered unthinkable 100 years ago. Luxuries, things that would have been considered luxuries back then, like air conditioning and multiple bathrooms, quartz kitchen countertops, closets so vast that you could play pickleball inside them. So you're getting more home today, and it really hardly feels like a Depression-era lifestyle for many, but there are some less fortunate people, and inflation has widened this gap between the haves and the have-nots. So what are your thoughts, especially when it comes to housing and the fact that you're getting more today, but not everyone is?
Because of advances in technology, number one, and number two, the fact that the average person is wired to produce more than he consumes and save the difference. Of course, we have more today than we did 100 years ago. That goes without saying. But It doesn't seem that way because even though workers are more productive than they were in the past, everything is financed with debt today. People talk about inflation as if it's just part of the cosmic firmament. It just happens. It doesn't happen. The government is the sole and entire cause of inflation. It does it by printing up money directly and indirectly. And what that does is it destroys the capital that you save. Americans save in dollars, okay? You want to get ahead? You produce more than you consume and you save the difference in dollars. But when the government destroys those dollars through inflation, your standard of living goes down. Now, that's been disguised through debt. It used to be that when you bought a house, you paid cash for it. Then, many years ago, it started out with a 5-year mortgage with 20% down. Now we're talking about 30-year mortgages so that you really never own your home. Inflation is the real problem. It destroys capital. It destroys people's standard of living. The standard of living, generally speaking, in the U.S. is going down. It's disguised by the fact that when you borrow money, you're either taking capital that people have saved in the past and you're using it for consumer goods now, or you're mortgaging your future for a higher standard of living today. All the debt we have in the U.S., I think, is unsustainable. And we could have either a credit collapse if they don't create money fast enough, or if they raise interest rates too high, or we could have something resembling a hyperinflation like we have down here in Argentina. Either way, it's going to be very, very bad news, because in an advanced industrial society like the U.S., to poison the money supply with inflation is asking for economic catastrophe. So I think what we're looking at over the next 10 years, and this is true for a number of reasons, not least of them, is the fact that Americans have elected in Washington people that are the equivalent of Jacobins during the French Revolution. I mean, they have the same ideas. I'm looking for very, very tough times, quite frankly, not just in the U.S., but almost everywhere in the world.
Today in the United States, compared to 100 years ago, one spends more of their income on housing and transportation and healthcare and less on food and clothing. And yeah, Doug, to your point about inflation, like dollars are such a poor measuring stick. That's why earlier when we look at the cost of housing, I tried to discard dollars by going ahead and looking at the ratio between the home price and the gold price. I brought up the point last month with our audience that actually there's no such thing as grocery inflation or rent inflation. It's the government that creates the inflation. So it's not landlords or grocers that are creating inflation. Those higher prices are just a consequence of the inflation that the central bank creates. And that's creating this erosion of the middle class, because those in the lower middle class and the poor, they don't have assets that benefit from the inflation, yet they have the same fixed consumer costs that we're talking about here, like housing, transportation, healthcare, food, and clothing. Talk to us some more about the problem in the government and how that could help lead us toward a silent depression. I know you brought up the point that the U.S. government is running embedded deficits of $2 trillion per year, and that number is going to go much higher, if only because the interest cost alone is $1 trillion per year.
Yeah, people have to stop looking at the government as being their friend. It's not. It's a predator. It's a dead hand on top of society. It's certainly not a cornucopia, which is the way most people see the government. The government will give them stuff.
Right.
The government will do stuff. No, it doesn't. The government produces absolutely nothing that it doesn't take away first from society as a whole. So people have to stop looking at the government as a friendly big brother. It's more like, increasingly, the kind of big brother that you might have discovered in George Orwell's 1984. If we want to save the idea of America, which is one of the best ideas that humanity's ever had, we have to get rid of the government, or as much of it as we can, and go back to the values, moral values, social values, type of thing that this country had 200 years ago when it was founded. I mean, that's my answer to the question. And the money The dollar itself is a floating abstraction. It's a fiat currency. It's an IOU nothing on the part of a bankrupt government, which can't even tax enough to give the money value. It just prints up more money and people out of inertia accept them. Well, there's nothing else they can use to trade. Look, we should go back to gold as being money, not even a gold-backed currency. A currency is money. It's just a medium of exchange and a store of value. You don't need to insert the government and a central bank in between you and what you do with your fellow citizens in a country. That's why we should use gold, which for thousands of years has proven to be the best thing to use as money. It's one of 92 naturally occurring elements. And just as aluminum is particularly good for building airplanes, uranium is particularly good for making nuclear power plants, gold has unique characteristics that make it unique, almost unique, for use as money. So the government shouldn't be involved in this at all. This is a radical thought, I know. Not something that most people have even thought about. They'll say, oh, this is completely ridiculous. This is off the wall. This is unrealistic. This is the direction that the country should be going. But it's going the opposite direction at an accelerating rate. So yeah, we're looking at a nasty depression. And it's been building up for many years. This isn't a recent phenomenon that's come up just since Biden, although the Bidenistas are making it much worse. This is a trend that's been building up slowly for decades.
With the government having all of that debt that I just mentioned, that would create the propensity for them to create even more dollars so they can pay back their own debt, which could create more inflation and just this perpetually vicious cycle. Doug and I are going to come back and talk more about where all this is headed. When you think about the profundity of some of these things, if our currency went onto a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard, the fact that the government would not even be involved in currency issuance anymore. As you think about that, Doug and I have more on the silent depression when we come back. This is Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. For a lender that's a specific expert with income property, you need Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. In GRE history, from beginners to veterans, they provided our listeners with more mortgages than anyone. It's where I get my own loans for single-family rentals up to fourplexes. Start your pre-qualification and chat with President Chaley Ridge personally. They'll even customize a plan tailored to you for growing your portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com. ridgelendinggroup.com. You know, I'll just tell you, for the most passive part of my real estate investing, personally, I put my own dollars with Freedom Family Investments because their funds pay me a stream of regular cash flow, and returns are better than a bank savings account, up to 12%. Their minimums are as low as $25K. You don't even need to be accredited for some of them. It's all backed by real estate, and I kind of love how the tax benefit of doing this can offset capital gains and your W-2 job's income. And they've always given me exactly their stated return, paid on time, so it's steady income, no surprises, while I'm sleeping or just doing the things I love. For a little insider tip, I've invested in their Power Fund. To get going on that, text FAMILY to 66866. Oh, and this isn't a solicitation. If you want to invest where I do, just go ahead and text FAMILY to 66866.
This is Rich Dad Sales Advisor Blair Singer. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, and above all, don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with Doug Casey, the international man, about the Greater Depression. That's really a silent depression as he sees it. And Doug, I want to know where you see us headed, because a lot of people see today unemployment under 4% in the United States. We have GDP growth that's decent. The rate of inflation is still higher than the Fed target, but it's come down substantially. The Fed's even talking rate cuts this year. So where do you see this all headed with the silent depression?
First of all, it's a big mistake to trust the government's numbers. If you look at the way the government computed unemployment and the way it computed inflation back in 1980, it's very, very different from the way these numbers are computed today. And if you computed them the way they did way back when, in 1980, you'd find that our current unemployment is something more on the order of 10%. And current inflation is not, I don't know what they say it is now, at 2%, 3%, 4%. It's also more like 10% or more. But with the amount of money that they've created, I mean, trillions of fiat dollars that have been cranked out of Washington in recent years, I expect we're going to see inflation go back to much, much higher levels. There's no limit to how bad it can get. And since the government has promised all these things to various pressure groups in the U.S., they have to be paid. The taxes aren't there to do it. The borrowing, they can't borrow anymore, especially as interest rates go up. And incidentally, I'd point out that because of the debasement of the currency, that's a better phrase to use than inflation. Debasement of the currency, it's an active thing that's done by the government and its central bank, whereas inflation, people think, well, maybe inflation's the fault of the butcher or the baker or the gasoline maker. No, it's not. Those people fight the effects of inflation. Inflation is something that comes out of Washington. Because the government has all these pressure groups that get all kinds of benefits, they're going to have to keep printing up money to pay for these things. And you're going to wind up in the same position as Argentina has wound up. In fact, it's going to be worse because unlike Argentina, which doesn't have any foreign involvements, they had a war with the Falklands 40 years ago, but there's basically no Argentine army. There's no Argentine navy to speak of. But the U.S. has 800 military bases scattered all over the world. They're very expensive to maintain. The natives aren't particularly happy to have foreign soldiers in their lands. In addition to the war in the Ukraine, why we're involved in a border war between two countries is a mystery to me. And now we have Israel and Gaza dusting it up. Listen, I feel sorry for both sides. But on the other hand, I don't pox out both their houses. It's not our problem. This has been going on between these people for 2,000 years, and the U.S. getting involved in it is going to add on to our ongoing bankruptcy and maybe start World War III. There's new wars popping up all over the world that are going to cost us huge amounts of money. And of course, the Defense Department spends giant amounts of money building high-tech toys, which are basically useless in today's military world. It goes on and on. It's a big problem. And I suspect we're going to reach a crescendo by the 2024 election, assuming we have one. I don't know who's going to win that election, if anybody, quite frankly. So we're looking at chaos, political chaos, economic chaos, the potential for a financial meltdown, because the whole world is built upon a foundation of debt, which is a very unstable foundation to build things on. And of course, you've got all kinds of sociological problems, starting with total and absolute corruption of the U.S. educational system, which is spread like poison throughout society. We're seeing that now, incidentally, with the presidents of Harvard and Penn and MIT, but all of the higher educational institutions in the U.S. suffer from the same problem. This is like a many-headed hydra where we can take any one instance of a problem in society, and when we examine it, you find that it's even worse than you might think. Like, for instance, I was talking about education. Your kids are being indoctrinated at great cost. I think it's the University of Michigan has 161, I believe that's the number for the University of Michigan, DEI administrators. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion administrators, all earning over six figures. And what are they doing? Well, they're justifying their positions by doing absolutely ridiculous things in education that should be about educating as opposed to enforcing somebody's goofy ideas of diversity and equity and inclusion. So anyway, we've got lots of problems beyond real estate and beyond the high level of rent that people have to pay today. But listen, it's so hard to build a new house, God forbid, build a new apartment building today. By the time you jump through all the hoops, local, county, state, federal, the cost of construction is probably twice what it should be because of inflation, because of regulations. I hate to be so gloomy, Keith. I do, but...
Well, there's a lot there. When we talk about diversity, we're in an era where people are very conscious of that, but a lot of people think of it with regard to race or gender or perhaps religion, but I like to champion diversity of thought as well. And then when it comes back...
we don't have any of that anymore.
Yeah, that's for sure. But when it comes back to the root of productivity, I think that's really important because whether the government gives away money to programs in the United States or outside the United States to Ukraine or Israel, whether you believe in that or not, and a lot of the giveaways have been in the hundreds of billions of dollars to those nations, we're now running a national debt of over $34 trillion. And my point is the United States doesn't produce as much as they used to. However, the United States produces a lot of dollars and a lot of debt. And when the government has giveaways, either domestically or internationally, a productive person is the one that has to end up paying for that. So, Doug, we think about a lot of the problems out here, much of it coming back to the root of inflation. Why don't you tell us more about what can be done? In fact, I know you have a practical, common sense way where you don't save in dollars. You and I have talked before about how real estate or gold can give you a hedge or even help you profit against inflation. But you've talked about the importance of real material things like food that you can store or light bulbs that you can put away or tools that you can use because you're also not taxed on those sorts of things. So can you tell us more about that?
There was a book written years ago, and it's still available on Amazon, by an old friend of mine named John Pugsley. And the book's name was The Alpha Strategy. The point that John made in that book was that rather than trying to save in dollars, you should save in things that have a long shelf life that you're going to need and use. So, for instance, if light bulbs, common thing, they burn out. If you wait until there's a sale on light bulbs, get them cheap, buy them in quantity, buy them extra cheap, put them aside, you're not going to have to buy a light bulb forever. Whereas if you don't plan ahead and do it that way, if your light bulb burns out, you don't have one, you got to get in your car, burn gasoline, buy it at the convenience store where it's going to cost you twice as much. And you can do this with many areas of your life. Planning ahead. In other words, this is a variation, if you would, on the old Mormon idea. A lot of people are aware that Mormons, their religion tells them that they should put aside 3 months or a year worth of food, and it's stored food, which is properly canned and so forth, so that no matter what happens, they'll always be able to eat. Well, the Alpha Strategy is something that you take that attitude towards food and you apply it to all the consumable things that you have in life. And as they go up in price, light bulbs go up from $1 to $5 with inflation. If you made an investment that kept pace $1 to $5, you'd have to pay capital gains tax on it. But you don't on the consumable that you put aside. So, I mean, this is just one of a number of strategies that you can use to counter the effects of currency debasement.
I love that as a strategy on what you can do. You are not taxed on the gain in price or value of an entire pallet of food or tools like a tractor or ladder or table saw. So it's a really elegant way to beat inflation. Doug, I have an idea, and it might not be one that you heard before. It might even make the listener laugh a little bit here. I have an elegant way to beat inflation and improve your quality of life at the same time. And it's something really simple. And that solution is to spend your money. It's an elegant way to beat inflation and improve your quality of life at the same time. If a Mediterranean cruise for you and your wife is going to cost $18,000 this year, and you think it's going to cost $22,000 next year, beat inflation, and get an experience that you'll never forget. Now, as long as you've got something set aside already, spend. That's a way to beat it and live a better life.
I can't argue with that, Keith, but on the other hand, it's wise to put aside capital for the future, because once you consume that cruise, the capital's not there anymore, and you may need it in the future. But this is one of the problems created by currency debasement. People start thinking in terms of live for today, because tomorrow we might die with their money. And that's not a good way to get wealthy, although it's true you do beat some of the effects of currency debasement that way.
Yeah, if there were no inflation, there would be less incentive to do something like that and spend. There'd also be less incentive to invest. But Doug, you've given us a lot of good ideas today for this creeping of the silent depression fueled by inflation and some actionable things about what we can do about it. Give us any last thoughts and then how our audience can learn more about you.
I've written a series of novels, well, they're quite well written, that explain a lot of these principles in the form of an exciting story. They're called Speculator, where our hero gets involved in gold mining in Africa and a bush war and so forth, and he becomes a drug lord, where we show a drug lord can also be a good guy, and then he becomes an assassin because he's so pissed off. There are 4 more novels to come, so I suggest people go on Amazon, pick up those 3 novels that are out there. That's one thing they should do. Second thing, I'd encourage you, go and subscribe to internationalman.com, and you'll get a great free daily blog from me and other people. It's really a good publication. And the third thing, on YouTube, is we have Doug Casey's Take, where once or twice a week I talk about different subjects.
Doug, though our subject is depression, our conversation has not been thoroughly depressing, so thanks so much for coming back out of the show.
Nice to see you again, Keith.
Well, you might wonder, what kind of prepper weirdo is going to save a bunch of durable goods like tires or crescent wrenches, or even store an extra car or a few extra cords of firewood? That may or may not be feasible for you, some of it having to do with your storage capacity, whether you live urban or rural. But what you can do, if you're really concerned about persistent inflation, is to beat it by making improvements to your own home. And you can do that sooner rather than later. And see, that way you might actually get to enjoy the item and integrate it into your lifestyle. For you, that might mean getting yourself new windows, or a new water heater, or renovating a bathroom, or remodeling the kitchen. And if you can avoid activities, though, that create a higher tax assessment, then you will not get taxed on those real assets, all while improving your quality of life at the same time. So there's an idea. Some real guidance spurred from today's chat with Doug Casey. Big thanks to him. Next week, I'll tell you more about the weird problem with my rent payment that was stolen from my property manager and what I'm going to do about it. My manager says he's not taking the loss. I'm not taking the loss either. Interesting stuff. Until then, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.